Elijah shivered in the cold, clutching his last dollar. He had nothing. But when he saw Shaq struggling to find change, he didn't hesitate. "Here, take it," Elijah said, offering the bill with a tired smile. Shaq stared at the homeless man, then at the dollar in his hand. The weight of that small gesture hit him hard. "No," Shaq said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're not giving me anything." He reached into his pocket, but what he pulled out made the entire street stop and stare. No one expected what happened next. "All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from." Shaq stepped out of his sleek black SUV, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. He stretched his arms, rolling his shoulders as he took in his surroundings. The convenience store wasn't anything special, just a small, run-down place on the corner, the kind where flickering neon signs buzzed and the air smelled faintly of cheap cigarettes and gasoline. As he walked toward the entrance, he could feel the weight of eyes on him. This wasn't the part of town where people drove luxury cars, and his presence was impossible to ignore. A couple of teenagers loitering near the store's side wall whispered to each other. Glancing at him, an old man on a bench stared, his gaze flickering between Shaq's expensive sneakers and the Rolex on his wrist. But one person held his attention, a thin, weathered man sitting near the curb, his body wrapped in layers of worn-out clothes despite the warm evening air. His hands were clasped together, knuckles protruding beneath pale skin. His beard was patchy, streaked with gray, and his tired eyes followed Shaq's every movement, not with resentment, but with something else, curiosity. Shaq pushed the door open, the bell above jingling as he stepped inside. The cool air conditioning hit him instantly. He grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and made his way to the counter. The cashier, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and a permanent scowl, barely glanced at him, too busy shooting dirty looks toward the homeless man outside. "That guy's been sitting there all day," the cashier muttered under his breath as he rang up Shaq's drink. "Always hanging around acting like he owns the place." Shaq ignored him, pulling out his wallet and handing over a bill. "Keep the change." As he stepped outside, he heard movement, quick footsteps. He turned just in time to see the homeless man rushing toward him, hand outstretched. Instinctively, Shaq took a half step back, prepared for anything. The man stopped a few feet away, breathless but steady. In his trembling hand was a single, crumpled dollar bill. "You dropped this." His voice was quiet, but there was a firm certainty in it. Shaq frowned. He instinctively patted his pockets. His wallet was still in his hand, and he knew for a fact he hadn't dropped anything. His gaze flicked from the dollar to the man's face. His hands were shaking, his clothes tattered, his shoes barely holding together. But his eyes didn't waver. Shaq hesitated. "That's not mine." "I know," the man said simply. Shaq stared at him, confused. "Then why are you giving it to me?" Shaq stared at the crumpled dollar bill in the man's outstretched hand, his mind working through the confusion. This wasn't some ordinary panhandler asking for spare change. This man was giving money away. "That's not mine," Shaq repeated, his deep voice calm but questioning. The man nodded, his expression unwavering. "I know, but I want you to have it." A scoff rang out from behind them. The store's cashier, who had been watching through the glass, now leaned against the doorway with a smirk. "Don't listen to him, man," the cashier said, shaking his head. "He's crazy, probably found that dollar on the sidewalk and now he's playing games." Shaq ignored him, his eyes locked onto the man in front of him. He was thin, too thin, his clothes hanging loosely on his frame. His tattered jacket had holes at the elbows and his sneakers were so worn that the rubber soles were peeling away. But despite his ragged appearance, something about him stood out. His posture was steady. His hands, though trembling slightly from what was likely hunger, didn't waver. His gaze was sharp, clear, and filled with a strange kind of certainty. Shaq frowned. "Why?" The man exhaled slowly, as if he'd been waiting for that question. "Because you look like someone who helps people." He shifted his weight, gripping the dollar between his fingers like it was something precious. "And I want to help too." Shaq's breath hitched for half a second. He wasn't expecting that. Most people with nothing to their name, especially in a situation like this, would be asking for help, not offering it. Yet here this man stood, trying to give something away, even when he had so little himself. Shaq reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. He flipped it open, quickly spotting the crisp $100 bills tucked inside. Without hesitation, he pinched one between his fingers, ready to offer it to the man. "Here," Shaq said, extending the bill. "If you want to help someone, help yourself first." But before he could press it into the man's palm, something unexpected happened. The man stepped back, his entire body tensed, his expression shifting from calm to almost uneasy. He shook his head, his fingers tightening around the dollar bill in his own hand. "No," the man said, his voice firmer this time. "I don't need money. I just wanted to do something good." Shaq froze, caught completely off guard. This wasn't about money, it never was. Shaq studied him, intrigued. "Then what do you need?" Shaq studied the man in front of him. His clothes were ragged, his shoes worn thin, but there was something steady in his posture, something unshaken in his eyes, the kind of determination that didn't come from having something. It came from having lost everything. "What's your name?" Shaq asked. The man hesitated, almost as if he had forgotten it himself. Then after a beat, he answered, "Elijah." Behind them, the store clerk scoffed, shaking his head. "That guy? He's been around here for years. Ain't got nothing to his name but bad luck." Shaq ignored the comment, keeping his focus on Elijah. "What's your story?" Elijah shrugged, shifting his weight. "Not much to tell." He exhaled slowly, his breath shaky but his voice firm. "Life just fell apart. Happens to the best of us." There was something about the way he said it. Not bitter, not desperate, just honest. Shaq had met plenty of people in his life. Successful people, broken people, liars, and hustlers. But Elijah didn't fit into any of those categories. He was different. "You lost everything," Shaq said carefully, reading the man's face. "And yet you still got kindness left?" Elijah let out a small chuckle. "Guess so." He looked down at the crumpled dollar bill in his hand. "I don't got much, but I still got that." Shaq was silent for a moment. The world had given this man nothing, yet here he was, still choosing to give something. It didn't make sense, and yet it made all the sense in the world. Then, without thinking too much about it, Shaq said, "Come with me." Elijah's entire body tensed. His expression changed in an instant. "No," he said, shaking his head quickly. "That's not a good idea." Shaq frowned. "Why not?" Elijah took a step back, his eyes darting around as if someone was watching. "You don't know me, man," Elijah muttered, "and you don't know what you're stepping into." Shaq's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just hesitation, this was fear. The store clerk, who had been listening in, scoffed again. "Told you. He's crazy. Just let him be." But Shaq wasn't convinced. Elijah wasn't crazy. He was afraid. Of what? That was the real question. "Elijah," Shaq said slowly, "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a fresh start. If you don't want it, that's fine. But I'm not going to pretend like I don't see what's really happening here." Elijah's jaw clenched. For a moment, it looked like he was about to walk away. Then, just as quickly, his shoulders sagged, and he let out a heavy breath. "You really want to know why I can't leave?" Elijah asked, voice barely above a whisper. Shaq nodded. Elijah hesitated for a long moment. Then finally, he said something that made Shaq's stomach drop. "I owe people," Elijah admitted. "People you don't want to mess with." The weight of those words settled between them. Shaq's expression didn't change. He had been around long enough to know that some debts weren't financial. They were chains. "What kind of people?" Shaq asked. Elijah exhaled sharply. "The kind that don't forgive and don't forget." The store clerk, suddenly looking a lot more nervous, glanced toward the window. His casual demeanor from before was gone. "Elijah," Shaq said firmly, "if you're in danger, you need help." Elijah let out a humorless chuckle. "Help?" He shook his head. "Ain't no help for people like me, man." Shaq wasn't convinced. Something about this didn't add up. Before he could say anything else, a slow, deliberate sound cut through the air. The low hum of an engine rolling up outside. Shaq instinctively turned his head. A black SUV pulled to a stop right outside the store. Elijah's entire body went rigid, his face drained of color. Shaq didn't need to ask. He already knew. Whoever was in that car, they weren't here for him. They were here for Elijah, and something told him they weren't here to talk. The SUV's doors opened slowly. Two men stepped out, their eyes locked on Elijah, and they weren't smiling. Shaq leaned against his car, arms crossed, eyes locked on Elijah. The homeless man stood stiffly, his thin fingers twitching against his sides. The black SUV idled in front of the store, its windows tinted so dark that not even the faintest shadow inside could be seen. The two men who had stepped out weren't in any hurry. They moved with the kind of confidence that came from knowing they were in control. Shaq recognized the type instantly. He'd been around long enough to know when someone was being hunted. "You know them?" Shaq asked quietly. Elijah didn't answer right away. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Yeah," he finally muttered. "I know 'em." Shaq's gaze flicked between Elijah and the two men, who were now slowly approaching. The air around them seemed to tighten, growing heavier with every step they took. Shaq didn't move. He simply waited, letting them come to him. One of the men, tall with slicked-back hair and a sharp, angular face, smirked. "Elijah," he drawled, "you got a lot of nerve showing your face out here." Elijah didn't respond. His shoulders hunched slightly like a man bracing for a hit. Shaq didn't like that. The second man, bulkier with a shaved head and a tattoo creeping up his neck, eyed Shaq's car. His expression twisted into something amused. "Nice ride," he commented, voice deep and gravelly. "Didn't know you were making new friends, Elijah." Shaq kept his posture relaxed, but his tone was firm. "He with you?" The tattooed man chuckled. "Oh, he used to be. But Elijah's got a bad habit of running from what he owes." Elijah finally spoke, his voice tight. "I told you I just needed more time." "Time's up," the slick-haired man said, stepping closer. Shaq uncrossed his arms, shifting his stance just slightly, enough to block Elijah from the two men. "Whatever he owes," Shaq said. "I'll cover it." Elijah's head snapped toward him. "Shaq, don't—" The slick-haired man laughed, a low, humorless sound. "Oh, you think this is about money?" He glanced at his partner, shaking his head. "Man, I love it when people think money solves everything." Shaq remained unfazed. "Then what's it about?" Tattooed guy cracked his knuckles. "Loyalty," he said. "And consequences." Shaq understood immediately. Elijah wasn't just in debt. He had crossed the wrong people. Elijah's breathing grew shallow. "Shaq, just go, man." Shaq ignored him. "So let me get this straight," he said, keeping his voice steady. "You're here to remind Elijah of his loyalty." Slickhair grinned. "Now you're catching on." Shaq exhaled slowly, glancing at Elijah. The man looked ready to bolt, but there was nowhere to go. Shaq had two options: walk away or get involved. He'd already made his choice. "You hungry?" Shaq asked Elijah suddenly. Elijah blinked. "What? You hungry?" Shaq repeated, louder this time. Elijah hesitated. "Yeah." Shaq turned back to the two men. "Then we're gonna eat." He nodded toward his car. "Unless you've got a problem with that." The two men exchanged looks. Tattooed guy's smirk faltered for the first time. Slick hair studied Shaq, as if seeing him differently now. Finally, he exhaled through his nose. "Enjoy your meal, Elijah. But remember, this ain't over." With that, they turned and walked back to the SUV. Shaq didn't move until the vehicle disappeared down the street. Only then did he look at Elijah. "Get in," he said. Elijah didn't move. "Shaq," his voice was barely above a whisper. "You don't know what you just did." Shaq shrugged. "Guess I'll find out." Elijah ran a hand over his face. "They're not gonna just let this go." "I don't scare easy," Shaq replied. Elijah sighed, shoulders sagging in defeat. Then, without another word, he climbed into the passenger seat. As Shaq pulled away from the curb, Elijah slumped back against the seat, exhaling shakily. He was safe, for now, but Shaq knew. This was far from over. Elijah's phone buzzed. He stared at the screen, his face draining of color. A single text: "You shouldn't have gotten in that car." Shaq tightened his grip on the steering wheel, stealing a glance at Elijah, whose knuckles were white as he gripped his own knees. His entire body had gone rigid, his breath coming in shallow bursts. The glow of passing streetlights illuminated his face, revealing the sheen of sweat forming along his hairline. "You want to tell me what's going on?" Shaq asked, keeping his voice calm but firm. Elijah swallowed hard, shaking his head. "I already told you. I owe some people. The kind of people you don't just walk away from." Shaq exhaled slowly. He'd dealt with men like that before. The kind who didn't forgive. The kind who never forgot. "How much?" he asked. Elijah scoffed bitterly. "It's not about money, man. If it was, I wouldn't still be breathing." That made Shaq pause. He eyed Elijah carefully. "Then what is it about?" Elijah hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the side mirror. "You ever heard of a man named Vincent Cole?" Shaq's stomach twisted at the name. Cole was a known name in underground circles, a businessman on the surface, but beneath that, something far more dangerous. Extortion, Laundering. Disappearances. Shaq kept his tone even. Yeah, I've heard of him. Elijah nodded grimly. Well, I used to work for him. Shaq let the weight of those words settle between them. He didn't need to ask what kind of work. You stole from him? Shaq guessed. Elijah let out a short, humorless laugh. Nah, worse, I left. Shaq understood immediately. Men like Vincent Cole didn't just let people walk away. A sudden vibration startled them both. Elijah's phone. He pulled it from his pocket and stared at the screen. His face went pale. Shaq glanced at it. A single message from an unknown number. You shouldn't have gotten in that car. Elijah muttered a curse under his breath. They know I'm with you. Shaq clenched his jaw. He didn't scare easy, but this wasn't just about Elijah anymore. If Cole had eyes on them, then Shaq was now involved. He pulled into a dimly lit parking lot behind a diner and killed the engine. Silence wrapped around them, heavy and suffocating. Start from the beginning, Shaq said. What did you do? Elijah exhaled, leaning forward with his head in his hands. I handled deliveries. That's all I was supposed to do. Pick up packages, drop them off. Never ask questions. He let out a shaky breath. But one day I did. Shaq remained quiet, letting him continue. It was supposed to be a routine drop. But the guy I was supposed to deliver to, he was dead. Not just dead, executed. And the package I had. Elijah lifted his head, his eyes haunted. It was empty, a setup. Shaq frowned. They framed you. Elijah nodded. Cole's way of making sure I was loyal. If I didn't clean it up, he'd pin it on me. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't make someone disappear. So you ran. Shaq finished. Yeah, Elijah whispered. But you don't run from Vincent Cole. A sudden noise cut through the quiet, the low, unmistakable hum of an engine. Shaq tensed, glancing at the rearview mirror. A black SUV had just pulled into the lot. The SUV's headlights switched off. The driver's door opened, and a man in a suit stepped out, heading straight for them. Shaq didn't need to ask who they were. The way they carried themselves, the slow, deliberate steps, the slight bulge under their jackets, told him everything. These weren't just some street thugs. They were professionals. Elijah stiffened beside him, his breathing quick and shallow. I told you, he murmured. I can't leave. The taller of the two men, a broad-shouldered guy with slicked-back hair and a scar along his jawline, took a step forward. His eyes, dark and calculating, flicked between Shaq and Elijah before settling on the latter. Elijah, he said smoothly, you know running doesn't change anything, right? Elijah swallowed hard, but he didn't answer. The second man, shorter but stockier, let out a low chuckle. We've been real patient, he said. Boss figured you needed some time. Time to think. Time to realize that you belong to him. Shaq's fists clenched. He doesn't belong to anybody. Scarjaw smirked, finally turning his full attention to Shaq. And you are? Shaq crossed his arms. Does it matter? The shorter man tilted his head, as if considering. Nah, he said. Not really, unless you're planning to get in the way. Shaq didn't flinch. I don't like bullies. Scarjaw let out a long, slow breath, shaking his head. See, that's the thing. This isn't about you. So why don't you be smart, hop back in your car and drive away? Let Elijah handle his own business. Elijah took a small step back, his shoulders tightening. I already told you, I'm done. Scarjaw sighed, rubbing his temple like he was dealing with a particularly frustrating child. That's not how this works. Shaq could feel the tension thickening in the air. The store clerk, who had been watching through the window, locked the door and quickly flipped the open sign to closed before disappearing into the back. Smart man. Elijah exhaled sharply. What do you want? Scarjaw's smirk widened. Oh, now he asks the right question. He took another step forward, so close now that Shaq could smell his cologne. Something expensive, but it did nothing to cover the rot beneath. You had a job, Elijah, Scarjaw continued. You were supposed to clean up a mess. Instead, you ran. That put the wrong kind of attention on us. Elijah's jaw tightened. I wasn't going to kill a man just because Cole said so. The shorter man's smile vanished. That man wasn't innocent. And now you've got us cleaning up after you. Shaq's gaze sharpened. So that was it. Elijah had been more than just a courier. He'd been tasked with silencing someone, and he'd refused. Scarjaw shrugged. Boss says you've got one chance to fix this. Elijah's hands curled into fists. I'm not doing it. The shorter man grinned. Then we'll make sure you never have the chance to say no again. Shaq stepped between them fully now, his presence towering, his voice cold. That's not happening. Scarjaw let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. You really don't know who you're dealing with, do you? Shaq didn't blink. I know exactly what I'm dealing with. A couple of bottom feeders trying to act like big dogs. The shorter man's face darkened. Watch your mouth, old man. Shaq smirked. Old enough to know how this ends. You take another. Him, and I promise you're not gonna like what happens next. For a moment, no one moved. Then, the shorter man reached into his jacket. Shaq was faster. Before the man could pull out whatever he was reaching for, Shaq's hand shot forward, grabbing his wrist in a vice grip. He twisted sharply, forcing the man to cry out and drop a switchblade onto the pavement. Scarjaw moved, but Shaq was already turning, his elbow smashing into the man's ribs, sending him stumbling backward. The shorter man clutched his wrist, cursing. You, try it again, Shaq said evenly. See what happens. Scarjaw straightened, breathing heavily, but there was something new in his gaze now. A flicker of recognition. He exhaled, rolling his shoulders. All right, that's how you want to play it? Shaq didn't move. Scarjaw nodded at the shorter man. Let's go. The man hesitated. What? We're just... Let's go, Scarjaw repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. The shorter man scowled but obeyed, rubbing his wrist as he walked back toward the SUV. Scarjaw lingered a moment longer. This isn't over, he said. Shaq met his gaze, unshaken. It is for you, Scarjaw smirked. You really don't know who you just pissed off. Then without another word, he turned and got into the SUV. The engine growled to life, and seconds later, they were gone. Elijah exhaled a breath he'd been holding, his hands shaking. Jesus. Shaq turned to him. You all right? Elijah let out a breathless laugh. Number. But thanks for that. Shaq studied him for a moment. You're not going back out there. Not alone. Elijah hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I think you might be right. Shaq turned his gaze toward the direction the SUV had disappeared. This wasn't over. Elijah's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. You should have taken the deal. Shaq's voice was calm, but there was an undeniable edge to it. He held his phone to his ear, eyes locked onto the two men in front of him. They had been so confident just moments ago. But now there was hesitation. The shorter man, Elijah had called him Cole, shifted uncomfortably. What do you think you're doing, old man? He sneered, trying to regain control of the situation. Shaq smirked, making things simple. Scarjaw, the one who seemed to be in charge, narrowed his eyes. Who the hell are you calling? Shaq didn't answer. Instead, he turned slightly, just enough to let the evening light catch the Rolex on his wrist, just enough to let them wonder. The line clicked. A voice answered on the other end. Yeah? Shaq didn't break eye contact with Scarjaw as he spoke. I need some people down here. Now. The voice on the line responded instantly. Location? Shaq gave them the name of the store, then ended the call. For the first time, real uncertainty flickered across the men's faces. Cole let out a forced laugh. What? You think we're scared of your rich friends? Shaq took a slow step forward. No, he said. I think you're smart enough to know when you've lost. Scarjaw tilted his head, considering. You don't even know what's going on here, do you? Shaq shrugged. I know you're threatening a man who doesn't owe you a damn thing. Cole scowled. He owes plenty. Elijah stiffened. I don't owe anything. Scarjaw smirked. You owe silence. Shaq's jaw tightened. Then I guess you're out of luck. The air was thick with tension. Then, headlights. A pair of black SUVs turned onto the street, moving slow and deliberate. They rolled to a stop just behind Scarjaw's vehicle, blocking it in. Cole cursed under his breath. Who the hell? Doors opened. Men stepped out, all dressed in black, moving with quiet precision. Not just muscle, security. High-end, professional. Scarjaw's confidence wavered. You've got people. Cute. Shaq let out a short laugh. You have no idea. One of the men from the SUVs stepped forward, nodding at Shaq. Sir. Shaq nodded back. Appreciate the quick response. The man's eyes flicked toward Scarjaw and Cole. These the ones causing trouble? Scarjaw clenched his jaw. This isn't over. Shaq raised an eyebrow. It is if you walk away. Cole looked like he wanted to argue, but Scarjaw grabbed his arm. We're leaving. Cole yanked his arm away. Are you kidding me? Scarjaw's voice was cold. Now. Cole hesitated, then glared at Elijah. You better hope we don't see you again. Elijah didn't flinch. I hope the opposite. Shaq's men didn't move as the two hustled back to their SUV. Moments later, their car sped off, tires screeching. The tension broke. Elijah let out a shaky breath. What the hell just happened? Shaq clapped a hand on his shoulder. I just made sure you're not dealing with them alone anymore. Elijah shook his head in disbelief. Who are you? Shaq smiled. Someone who believes in paying it forward. One of Shaq's security guys stepped forward, holding up a phone. Sir, you might want to see this. Shaq crossed his arms, watching the two black SUVs roll. Up in perfect unison. Their engines hummed softly as they parked, completely blocking off any escape route for the two men who had just threatened Elijah. Scarjaw and Cole stiffened. They weren't grinning anymore. The doors of the SUVs opened at the same time, and out stepped Shaq's personal security team. Tall, broad men dressed in black, moving with a quiet, disciplined confidence. These weren't just bodyguards. These were professionals. Cole swallowed hard. Who the hell did you call? Shaq didn't answer. He didn't need to. One of his men, a sharp-eyed man named Davis, approached. Sir, he greeted, scanning the situation with a practiced eye. Everything all right? Shaq nodded, but his eyes never left Scarjaw and Cole. These two seem to think they run the streets, he said casually. Figured it was time to remind them otherwise. Scarjaw took a small step back, weighing his options. His confidence was cracking. Cole, however, wasn't so quick to back down. He scoffed, shoving his hands into his pockets like he wasn't fazed. What, you think a couple of fancy security guards scare us? Davis barely looked at him. We're not here to scare you. Scarjaw's jaw tensed. Then what the hell are you here for? Shaq finally spoke, his voice even, steady. To let you know you're done. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Cole's bravado faltered. He looked from the security team to Scarjaw, then back to Shaq. You think you can just shut this down with a few guys in suits? Shaq smiled. I think I already have. Davis stepped forward, his presence alone enough to make Cole take another step back. We looked into you two on the way over, he said smoothly. You're not exactly ghosts. Scarjaw's head snapped toward him. What the hell does that mean? Davis smirked. It means we know exactly who you are, what you've been up to, and trust me, you don't want to see what happens next if you don't walk away. Elijah watched in stunned silence as the men who had terrorized him for years suddenly seemed small, powerless. Scarjaw's fists clenched, his mind clearly racing through options. Then finally he exhaled sharply. He knew when he was outmatched. This isn't over, he muttered. Shaq tilted his head slightly. You sure about that? Scarjaw hesitated. Then without another word, he turned and started walking toward his SUV. Cole lingered for a second longer, glaring at Elijah before reluctantly following. The moment they got inside, Shaq's men stepped forward, making it clear that they wouldn't be leaving until they did. The SUV's tires screeched as it reversed out of the parking lot, speeding away into the night. The tension lingered in the air for a moment, then broke. Elijah let out a long, shaky breath. What just happened? Shaq clapped a hand on his shoulder. You just got your life back. Elijah turned to him, eyes wide with disbelief. You... He shook his head. Who are you? Shaq just smiled. Before Shaq could answer, Davis's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then frowned. Sir, we have a problem. Shaq leaned back in his chair, the low hum of the city around them blending into the quiet jazz playing in the background. The restaurant was upscale, the kind of place where the silverware gleamed under soft lighting, and the waitstaff moved like ghosts, perfectly attentive, but never intrusive. Across from him, Elijah sat stiffly, his fingers gripping the edge of the white linen tablecloth. His eyes darted around the room, as if he didn't belong there. You can relax, Shaq said, setting down his water glass. Elijah exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Man, I don't get you. Shaq raised a brow. What do you mean? Elijah gestured around them. This, all of this. Fancy dinner, security team, acting like you just wiped my problems away like it's nothing. What do you want from me? Shaq studied him for a moment before leaning forward. I want to hear your story. Elijah scoffed. You already know the story. Guy falls on hard times, makes some bad choices, ends up homeless, right? Shaq shook his head. That's what everyone sees. I want to know the parts they don't. Elijah hesitated, his fingers twitching slightly against the table. Then, after a long moment, he spoke. I had a life once, he started, his voice low. Not a fancy one, but a good one. Job, apartment, people who counted on me. He exhaled, rubbing his temple. Then it all went sideways. My mom got sick. Cancer. The bills stacked up fast, and I did everything I could to keep up, but it wasn't enough. She needed better treatment, and I got desperate. Shaq listened, silent. Elijah swallowed hard. A guy came to me with an offer. Quick money, easy work, said all I had to do was run some packages across town, no questions asked. He let out a bitter chuckle. I was stupid enough to believe it was harmless. Shaq already knew where this was going. Turns out I was a courier for some real bad people. Drugs, stolen goods, you name it. At first, I told myself it wasn't hurting anybody, that I was just moving things from one place to another. But deep down, I knew better. He sighed. Then one night, a deal went south. I was supposed to drop something off, but I got jumped before I could. Package got stolen. The people I was working for, they didn't care about explanations. They just saw me as a liability. Shaq's jaw tightened. They came after me, Elijah continued. Beat me, left me bleeding in an alley. Told me I owed them for what was lost, but I had nothing left. My mom had already passed. I had no job, no home, nothing. So, I ran. Figured if I disappeared, they'd forget about me. He let out a humorless laugh. Guess I was wrong. Shaq nodded slowly. That's why they were still after you. Elijah clenched his jaw, staring down at the table. Yeah, and I know you scared them off tonight, but they don't let people go. Not really. Silence stretched between them. Then Shaq leaned forward. Come work for me. Elijah's head snapped up, his eyes wide. What? Shaq didn't blink. You heard me. You need a second chance. I can give you one. Elijah shook his head. Man, you don't even know me. I know enough. Elijah stared at him, searching his face for any sign of a joke. Why? Why would you do that? Shaq leaned back. Because someone once gave me a shot when I needed it. And because I know what it's like to have people count you out before they even know who you are. Elijah swallowed hard. Shaq continued. I've got businesses, restaurants, charities, outreach programs. I can find a place for you. A real place where you don't have to look over your shoulder every second of the day. Elijah's hands curled into fists on the table. And if I say no, Shaq shrugged, then you walk out of here and I don't stop you. But I think you want more than just running and surviving. I think you want to live again. Elijah sat there, breathing heavily. He looked down at his reflection in the polished surface of the table, at the man he had become. Then slowly he met Shaq's eyes. You're serious? Shaq nodded. Dead serious. Elijah exhaled, his hands shaking slightly. All right, I'm in. But just as he said it, Shaq's phone buzzed. He glanced down, an unknown number. His gut told him this wasn't over. Elijah wiped his hands on a clean white cloth, adjusting the cuffs of his neatly pressed shirt. The restaurant hummed with quiet sophistication. Low-lit chandeliers, crisp linen tablecloths, and the scent of seared steak and fresh herbs wafting from the open kitchen. 1 month ago he was sleeping on cold pavement. Now, he was standing at the front of a high-end restaurant, not as a customer, not as a worker scraping by in the back, but as the manager. Shaq had pulled some strings, made a few calls, and got him a shot, and Elijah hadn't wasted a second of it. Table 4 needs their wine decanted, a server said, passing by. I got it, Elijah replied smoothly, grabbing a bottle of Bordeaux from the rack. His hands were steady, not shaking, not hesitant. He had spent years thinking he was nothing, but now, when he looked in the mirror, he didn't see a broken man. He saw someone rebuilding, someone who refused to stay buried. He made a point to hire people who needed a second chance, dishwashers who had been counted out, cooks who had been on the streets, waitstaff who had nowhere else to go. Just like Shaq had given him a shot, Elijah was passing it forward. Tonight, the restaurant was packed. Soft jazz played in the background. Businessmen, couples, even a few celebrities occupied tables, chatting over perfectly plated entrees. Then Elijah saw him, the store clerk. The same clerk who had sneered at him, called him crazy, worthless. The man walked in, stopping dead as his eyes locked onto Elijah. For a moment, there was silence. You, the clerk stammered, blinking like he had seen a ghost. You work here now? Elijah didn't hesitate. He smiled. Yeah, he said easily. Crazy, right? The clerk glanced at Elijah's neatly buttoned shirt, the confidence in his posture, the way he carried himself now. His eyes darted to the restaurant's decor, the wealthy patrons, the success dripping from every inch of the place. Elijah could see the gears turning in the clerk's head. That's good, man, the clerk said, clearly caught off guard. Really good. Elijah simply nodded, refusing to let bitterness creep into his voice. Let me know if you need a table. The clerk hesitated, then gave a half nod before walking toward the bar. Elijah took a deep breath, letting the moment settle over him. He had won, but just as he exhaled, feeling a rare moment of peace, something shifted. Through the glass windows of the restaurant, parked directly across the street, sat a black SUV. Elijah's stomach dropped. His fingers curled into fists. He knew that car. His past had found him. Again. Elijah's fingers curled into fists as he stood frozen at the restaurant's entrance. The black SUV across the street sat idling, its headlights off, windows tinted. He knew that car. It had been parked outside his old shelter once. It had followed him down dark alleys when he had nothing left but the clothes on his back. Now it was here, watching him. The door clicked open. A man stepped out, his polished dress shoes tapping against the pavement. Elijah's stomach twisted. Dante Ramirez, the enforcer, the man who had collected debts for men far more powerful than himself. Elijah had prayed he'd never see him again. Dante took his time, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive suit as he walked toward the restaurant entrance. He wasn't bulky like most enforcers. He was lean, snake-like, with eyes that never showed emotion. His cold smirk never faltered. "Nice suit, Elijah," Dante sneered. "Guess you forgot about us, huh?" Elijah forced himself to breathe. The restaurant was behind him, filled with people. His new life. He wasn't the same man Dante had hunted before, but right now, he felt like that terrified version of himself all over again. He swallowed hard. "I don't want any trouble." Dante chuckled, stepping closer. "Then give us what we're owed, one way or another." Elijah's blood ran cold. A gust of wind sent a napkin fluttering across the sidewalk. The city moved around them, cars passing, streetlights flickering, but in this moment, it felt like he and Dante were the only two people in the world. Elijah's heart pounded. He couldn't go back. Not to them. Not to the life he thought he had escaped. He had clawed his way out of that darkness. He had been free. He had been safe, hadn't he? Dante exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "See? Here's the thing, Eli. I don't care about your little second chance." Elijah's breath hitched at the name. No one called him Eli anymore. That was a name from his past. Dante leaned in. "I care about what you owe, and I'm not leaving without it." Elijah's hands clenched. "I don't have anything left to give you." Dante smirked. "That's where you're wrong." The SUV's back door opened. Another man stepped out, larger, more intimidating. He cracked his knuckles, looking Elijah up and down like a predator sizing up a wounded animal. Dante's smirk widened. "You might have cleaned yourself up, but we both know." He gestured to the restaurant behind him. "This? It's borrowed time. You still belong to us." Elijah shook his head. "Number I don't." Dante sighed, stretching his neck. "Then I guess we do this the hard way." Elijah's pulse skyrocketed. He had a choice, run, fight, or give in. And then, a deep voice rumbled from behind them. "I'd rethink that if I were you." Elijah's chest tightened. Dante stiffened. His smirk faltered just a little. The second enforcer turned slightly, just enough for Elijah to see who had spoken. Shaq. Towering. Unshaken. And he wasn't alone. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Shaq stood tall under the glow of the streetlights, his presence commanding the kind of respect that made even the most dangerous men hesitate. Dante Ramirez, the enforcer, turned toward the voice, his smirk faltering for the first time. The second man, larger and bulkier, shifted slightly, glancing toward the shadows behind Shaq. He wasn't alone. Behind him, 3 men in dark suits stood motionless, their expressions unreadable. Shaq's security team, silent, composed, but ready. Dante let out a slow breath, trying to mask his unease. He turned back to Elijah, his smirk creeping back onto his face like a snake coiling before a strike. "What? You gonna buy your way out of this?" Dante taunted, his voice dripping with forced confidence. Shaq didn't flinch, didn't react. Instead, he took a step forward, closing the distance between them. He towered over Dante, his eyes steady, unwavering. "No," Shaq said, his voice calm yet carrying an undeniable weight. "I'm gonna make sure you never pull this on anyone again." Elijah swallowed hard. He had never seen Dante hesitate before. He had always been the one with the upper hand, the one controlling the room, but not this time. Dante's expression flickered, just for a second. Then he chuckled. "You got no idea who you're messing with, big man," he said, tilting his head. "This ain't just about some past debt. Elijah owes us, and debts don't just disappear." Shaq raised an eyebrow. Oh, I know exactly who you are. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped the screen. A second later, Dante's own face appeared. A news article, a wanted notice, fraud, extortion, assault. Dante's smirk vanished. The second man stiffened, shifting his weight slightly, preparing to move. Shaq didn't give them the chance. From around the corner, blue and red lights flashed. Police sirens pierced the silence. Dante spun, his hands clenching into fists as he realized what was happening. Shaq had already set the trap. "You see," Shaq said, his voice almost casual, "I don't make empty promises. I don't throw money at problems and walk away. I finish what I start." The sirens grew louder. Tires screeched. 2 police cruisers pulled up, their headlights blasting over the scene. Dante took a step back. His hands twitched at his sides. The second man was already turning, eyes darting for an escape route. Too late. 4 officers stepped out, guns drawn, voices sharp. "Hands where we can see them!" Dante cursed under his breath, his entire body tense. For the first time since Elijah had met him, he looked afraid. He turned to Elijah as if trying to salvage control. "This ain't over," he snarled, voice low, dark. "You think a couple of cops change anything? You think he saved you?" He gestured toward Shaq. "You're still ours." Elijah took a deep breath, and then for the first time he stepped forward, not back. He met Dante's gaze head on. "No," Elijah said, his voice steady. "I don't belong to you anymore." Dante's jaw clenched. One of the officers moved in, twisting Dante's arms behind his back, slapping cuffs on his wrists. The second man tried to run. He made it 2 steps before Shaq's security team caught him. He hit the pavement hard, his breath whooshing out as a knee pressed between his shoulder blades. The officers secured him within seconds. Dante struggled against the cuffs, eyes burning as he glared at Shaq. "This ain't over." Shaq tilted his head slightly, unfazed. "It is for you." Dante's breath came fast and sharp, his confidence completely shattered. As the officers hauled him toward the cruiser, Elijah let out a slow breath. His past was being loaded into the back of a police car. For so long, he had been afraid that he would always be running. Now, he was free. Elijah turned to Shaq, his voice quiet but filled with something unfamiliar. Relief. You planned this?" Shaq smiled. "Never underestimate what $1 can do. What do you think Elijah will do with his second chance? Drop your thoughts below."